Hello and welcome to the video on the history that leads up to the Aeneid. This is simply to give you the background you need to understand a lot of what Virgil is talking about. Here's a very important note. This is a very, very broad brush of this history. There are whole classes of at universities that can deal with this time period. We are going to go over very basically some events that unfold that lead you to understanding certain events in the Aeneid. So some events will be given simply because they're very relevant to the Aeneid, and some events because they are simply so important that it would be impossible to understand the context needed without them. I've tried to combine the two, and I've left out a lot of things. So I highly encourage you, if you're interested, to look beyond this video for information on this time period. It's a fascinating time period, and it produced some of the great literature and stories for other literature, like in Shakespeare, of the world, of the Western world. So please, if you're interested, dive deeper into all of this. Do not use this video as enough. It is simply to give you some background to understand the Aeneid. So our narrative begins actually in Gaul, which is ancient France. Caesar had just fought a war there for almost 10 full years, if not a full 10 years, and conquered most of Gaul, and a little bit into Britain as well. So he is fresh off of a giant campaign to defeat an enemy of Rome that always, throughout Roman history, kind of invoked fear. The Gauls were always fearsome and to be feared, and they could strike, and they've burned Rome before in the time of Camillus. And it's kind of a very glorious campaign for Caesar. However, he did extend his governorship a bit long. He was massively in debt to a lot of people, and they were ready to prosecute him. And so as you may have heard, famously, the Senate declares him an enemy of the state as he refuses to give up his command of Gaul and come home. He and the Senate are not able to negotiate any kind of resolution that would allow him not to be prosecuted. And so Caesar, with this massive army, says essentially, all right, well, we're coming home anyway. And it seems like he planned this. It seems like he knew this was in the cards because Roman history had been going such with Marius and Sulla, and with if you kind of take Catiline as an example in the 60s, he saw that Rome was basically ruled by a bunch of warlords and people that are stretching the republic and its limits for individual power. He knew this, and he probably had this planned in advance. But when he sees the opportunity, he crosses the Rubicon River. The Rubicon River is in northern Italy, and it's kind of the boundary. You're not supposed to march an army across as you enter into mainland Italy, or else you're considered an enemy, somebody invading Rome. And so you can imagine, since he did not have his army in parade formation, but is invading across the Rubicon, then he has declared war upon Rome, his own country, and thus sparking a civil war. Just a fun Latin thing, it is probably not true, but maybe it's true, I don't know. But he is said to, as he crossed the Rubicon, say, alia iacta est, which means the die has been cast, kind of meaning that fate is now underway. We are going to figure out where the fates lie. So it's kind of cool. This is all happening, by the way, in 49 BC. So in 49 BC, you get the crossing of the Rubicon and the start of the Civil War. And now the Civil War is essentially between Pompey and Caesar. Now Pompey is this guy down here. He was probably he probably had a better career than Caesar until the Gallic Wars. He did massively important things out east and expanded the empire through a bit of what is now Turkey. He had vast networks that he established in Greece and Egypt, and was essentially the driving force behind Rome out east for a few decades even. And he had famously come back to Rome. People thought he might pull a Marius and Sulla at one point as he came back east. This is in the like 60s or 70s, and he essentially said, no, 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 not one of those. I'm a good member of the Republic, and it just goes to show that story that people then were, every time a person returned home from being on campaign, they kind of thought of Marius and Sulla, thinking like they could just invade. There's nothing to protect Rome from itself, from its own generals. So Pompey is massively popular, it seems. And the politicians in Rome, not so much. So Pompey started surrounding himself with politicians so that he could have political sway, but he did hold a lot of popularity with the people in general. He was a very important figure. And then Julius Caesar kind of came on a bit about a decade after Pompey, and really made it, like he made a name for himself early. But when he was in the triumvirate, and then again he got the consulship in 60, he then went to Gaul, and Gaul was vastly important for him because it gave him wealth, it gave him power, it gave him a lot of troops that were loyal to him. And they're going to be important as we go forward. But this kind of is the beginning of your important part of the Aeneid, because the legacy of Caesar is never going to fade, as you'll find out in this video. And so they fight a civil war. It doesn't actually last a whole bunch of time. It's about, 3 to 5 years. So Pompey dies after only a couple of years. The civil war technically drags on a little bit longer, and Caesar dies in 44. So this is not a massively long war, but Caesar does kind of like clean up. He does kind of defeat Pompey, and we're going to talk more in detail about that in the next slide. But the last part, I guess you have to know, is that the final battle is in Pharsalus. It's in Greece, and Pharsalus is the point where Caesar beats Pompey, and you can consider Pompey defeated. And it becomes a very famous battle because it essentially sparks Julius Caesar's reign. It kind of kicks him off as somebody who can do whatever he wants now that there's nobody standing in his way. And so we'll talk about the end of Pompey here in a second. Now, after the Battle of Pharsalus, Pompey, as I said, he has many connections in Greece, Egypt, and the East, decided to ask his friend, the Pharaoh of Egypt, for help. And so after Battle of Pharsalus, he's almost got nothing. He probably knows he's almost defeated, and he really needs somebody's help if he's going to make something of this war. So he goes to the Ptolemy that's in charge, the Pharaoh of Egypt. And the Pharaoh knows about the civil war. He kind of realizes that Pompey isn't going to win. And so Pompey sails there, and the Pharaoh actually has him assassinated before he even gets to shore, which is kind of this pencil drawing, this sketch drawing that I've posted here. He's still on the boat, he's still in the water, and he's assassinated and beheaded. And that's the end of Pompey the Great. But the Pharaoh is actually a good friend. Actually, his father was a good friend of Pompey. And so it's a very interesting thing. Why would he do that? Well, he knew that Caesar was going to be close behind Pompey. And the Pharaoh decided that it would be a good idea if he was able to give Caesar a present of his enemy's head when he came to Egypt, trying to get on Caesar's good side. The weird part about that is that he kind of misjudged Roman culture. So Caesar ends up arriving as expected a couple days later, and the Pharaoh presents the head of Pompey to him. And Caesar is actually appalled. He's like, "Are you kidding me? You can't do that." He says, "You're an Egyptian. You cannot kill a Roman like that." And then he, in turn, ends up kind of like overthrowing the Egyptian government. Now, Caesar doesn't just do this like out of rash action. He actually had a plan. It turns out the Pharaoh's sister, Cleopatra, was trying to like have a little bit of an uprising in Egypt and take power for herself. Female pharaohs in the past had been not common, but they were famously there. And so Cleopatra ended up being kind of a nice ally for Caesar, as he overthrew the state, as that he can plug his own person in. So he kind of like puts Cleopatra in charge of Egypt, and I think the there's kind of a personal and a political relationship there. Personal being that a very famous love story. There's many movies written about these things. You can go watch. Elizabeth Taylor, I think, plays Cleopatra at one point. It's very good. And Caesar likes having his person in charge. Now, Cleopatra is kind of not one to take orders from people, but I think she also is savvy enough to know that this is her way to get into power, so she kind of agrees. And I think it's very important. While it's not historically accurate, the Roman view on these things is that there's a North African woman in charge of a country, and that she is a bit deceitful. Again, this is kind of the Roman mentality on these things, and it's very important as you read the Aeneid Book 4 to understand that mentality of a woman who's out for her own good and is being quote unquote treacherous. Being in charge of a country in North Africa is going to play a big role in the Aeneid, and so Caesar and Cleopatra famously have an affair. They have an illegitimate child, which is only important when Octavian decides that he is the rightful heir because of the will of Caesar. And anybody that thinks he has a blood son, well, he probably does, but that's besides the point, apparently. So, very, very, very important thing that Cleopatra becomes the head of the vassal state that is Egypt. This also gives Caesar some leverage because he knows that Egypt is where the grain is, and if Rome has any kind of grain shortage, having somebody in charge in Egypt that can send grain immediately is extremely, extremely important. So it's very tactical of Caesar as well to have a person in charge in Egypt. But anyway, that all becomes important because Egypt is going to be the site of another. They're going to come back. Cleopatra's going to come back, not just as an ally of Caesar, but as an enemy of Octavian in the next civil war. So she kind of plays whatever cards she needs to stay in power. She does right by her people in that regard, and it becomes almost the scene for the upcoming conflict. You see Pompey die here. You see Caesar kind of finalize his power in Egypt, solidify his power, and yeah, like this is going to lead to the end of the Republic as we know it. So after the Civil War, which doesn't technically really end, but like there's nobody really fighting against Caesar on a level that would matters. So I guess we'll say after the Civil War, but knowing that it was still a little bit ongoing. Caesar proclaims himself dictator for life. And as you know from your previous histories of Rome, this is kind of interesting because dictators were very set time limit. They had very set time limits, and they were a legal office, but they were always done kind of carefully. You can remember Cincinnatus being the one who gave it up after only a couple days after he did his job, and everybody saw that as the ideal. You saw Camillus take spoils and maybe of a city and maybe use them badly to where they exiled him for abuse of power. So the Romans have a history of making sure dictatorship doesn't last a long time and is only to be done for emergencies because they're afraid of kings since 509 BC. But Caesar proclaims himself dictator for life, which is almost like saying I am king, except not doing so because kings are bad. And so you can see here like a complete death of the Republic. The Republic is technically dictators are still a legal part of it, but as dictator for life, the Republic is not functioning, obviously. So it is dead. And Caesar does a lot of things. I'll brush over them way too briefly. But one of them that's very famous is he shows clemency to everybody. That instead of doing the Marius and Sulla prescription idea, he decides to go and forgive everybody, for better or for worse, to try to bring Rome back together. This is relatively popular. However, it doesn't seem to be the best idea in hindsight, given the picture down below here that you get on the Ides of March in 44. Those senators are clearly happy to have killed a tyrant. Brutus famously giving the last blow, sic semper tyranni, so always for tyrants. It's a very famous, very, very famous thing that you can study on your own. But this is the end of Julius Caesar. It kind of abruptly ends like that. And the problem then becomes the aftermath. It's clear the Republic cannot just go back to normal. It allowed a dictator for life, a popular one, to exist, and it needed somebody with that kind of power in order to function. It was getting nothing done. People were very upset about their government at that time. So it's hard to imagine the Republic just going back to the way it was. The idealists in the room thought it could. It could not. So we have a power vacuum. Now, three people try to fill, or three, factions try to fill the power vacuum, and they have to kind of work together at first, and then they all kill each other in the end. The first one I'm going to show you right here. The first person to take power is, or try to take power is Mark Antony. He gives the eulogy speech, famously, if you read Shakespeare. Amazing speech. Go read it. Go watch Marlon Brando perform it. It's amazing. But he tries to step in and become one of the heirs of Caesar's power. And he was a good friend of Caesar's in the Gallic Wars, fought with him as a kind of a co-general. And so he's a very good friend of Julius Caesar. And so he figures that this is his opportunity to take on some power that Julius Caesar had. In his will, Julius Caesar officially adopted a guy named Octavian, his great nephew. He'll end up being one of the great leaders of Rome in a few slides here. But he adopts him, and thus he inherits his estate. And so the other faction trying to fill is also sided with Julius Caesar, and that is the side of Octavian, who gets all of the money and the possessions and all of the estate. So you get kind of Mark Antony, who probably is better suited to take the soldier loyalty of Caesar, and then you have Octavian, who can get all of the money and all of the prestige and the name and everything like that Caesar had, that had a lot of weight at that time. They're both going to try to fill this vacuum, and they're going to do so by working together at first. But then the third faction, of course, is the Senate, who just assassinated the leader. They want to restore the Republic, and so they are going to try to do that as well. They don't really have a say with the second triumvirate. So it kind of becomes a three-way power vacuum that are trying to fill the positions, and it's kind of a tumultuous time. But so this creates a bit of an issue. Now, this is the result of this power vacuum, the final who gets to take charge, is going to directly influence the Aeneid, which is why this is kind of where it starts getting a little bit more pertinent. But these are things we all have to remember as we read the Aeneid. And so we talked a second ago about the three-way power vacuum. Two of these factions, Octavian and Mark Antony, end up deciding to start another triumvirate, a tradition that Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus had done back 20 years earlier or so. And you get Octavian, Mark Antony, and a guy named Lepidus all starting a kind of a three-way power structure in Rome. This is pretty clear. The Senate doesn't seem to have a place in the new government. They do try to go raise an army, and essentially Octavian and Antony have to team up against them, and they do, and they kind of they take care of the Senate, and finally the people who are representing the Republic are finally defeated, and the Republic is officially gone. It doesn't have a chance of coming back. But that leaves kind of this situation where you have a two-way power vacuum at this point after the Senate's defeated. And you get Octavian and Mark Antony kind of vying for power. Lepidus, I feel bad for the guy. He doesn't really have much say in much. He's kind of there to make sure that Octavian and Mark Antony try to work together. But they decide to divide the empire, so they're going to rule it kind of by region. And so Octavian says, well, I'll take Italy and Gaul and Spain and all the places that Caesar did well. And Antony took the east, and you can see it in this map down below right here, where you have the red is Augustus's kind of territory in this division of power. You can see the yellow is Mark Antony's. And then Lepidus gets this chunk right here that includes the new city of Carthage, which isn't nearly as cool as the original. And Leptis Magna a pretty formidable sized city down there, but this is clearly just to get him out of the way. He doesn't have any potential to do anything in North Africa. So you really are seeing kind of a two-way civil war, almost like a Pompey Caesar. Now you get Octavian Anthony situation. Octavian clearly has the advantage with ruling the actual city of Rome. Mark Antony thinks that he can kind of ally himself then with Cleopatra in Egypt and rule the eastern provinces, and then create a formidable fighting force and defeat Octavian. They fight a giant civil war. The Battle of Actium happens. This is the Battle of Actium happens. This is where Octavian defeats Mark Antony. It's probably not Octavian himself, more like Agrippa, Marcus Agrippa, his military guy. At the Battle of Actium, we finally see a defeat of Antony and Cleopatra, and it's actually a sea battle, so it's kind of cool. But that's the end of Mark Antony. Now, to rewind a little bit, Mark Antony's very famous relationship with Cleopatra becomes another Shakespeare story, to where Octavian actually kind of slanders him in Rome. This is one of the important things about Octavian still having Rome, is that he can kind of be there controlling the messaging of the civil wars. And he's basically saying that, look, Antony used to be a Roman, but he sold out. Cleopatra has corrupted him, and he's become an Egyptian and all that stuff. So it kind of plays very heavily here to get the public opinion toward Octavian away from Mark Antony. The fact that he was trying to ally himself with the Egyptians and fight against Octavian's Romans became a kind of a source of propaganda. And so what you see there is something that's going to influence Virgil's writing when you talk about Book 4 of the Aeneid, with Dido being a North African queen who Aeneas is kind of staying with for a while. And so you can kind of see that the Cleopatra takes a role twice in this whole narrative, in that she is the kind of ally and lover of Julius Caesar, and also the ally and lover of Mark Antony. And in one case, it's kind of okay because Julius Caesar's a quote-unquote good guy to both of these parties, Octavian and Mark Antony. So you have to kind of balance in the Aeneid this appropriate relationship, like which we would say Julius Caesar had, versus Mark Antony, who had, I guess, a quote-unquote inappropriate relationship with Cleopatra. The relationships were not all that different. It's just simply who's telling the story becomes important. So when Octavian is having somebody else tell the story, obviously the Mark Antony way is wrong and the Julius Caesar way is right. So that's kind of the idea that comes out of there, and there's more to discuss there as we read the Aeneid. But anyway, this all results in the defeat of Mark Antony and Cleopatra at the Battle of Actium, and that leads to a situation where we have only one person to fill the power vacuum. And again, the Republic is dead. There's no Republic, so Octavian is going to figure out what to do with a broken government. We can zoom in for a second on the relationship between Antony and Cleopatra here. So first of all, if you look at these coins, it's kind of interesting. This is the same coin, front and back. One of them is Cleopatra, and one of them is Mark Antony. And so they are minted during the relationship between these two on the same coin, kind of showing their relationship. It's in Greek. But you get Cleopatra and Mark Antony on the same, or on the flip sides of a coin, showing their alliance and relationship. It's kind of interesting, a little bit of historical evidence there. And what I like in this picture is very cool, because this is actually after Mark Antony is dead. And this image down here shows you Cleopatra, right here. And what she's doing is gesturing, and this is Octavian right here as he visits Egypt, having defeated Mark Antony and Cleopatra. He visits Egypt, and Mark Antony is dead, but Cleopatra is still around, and she has to figure out the relationship between Octavian and herself. This is before she famously commits suicide by snake. And you'll notice, very interestingly, this guy right here and this guy right here, these are both Julius Caesar, so she seems to have this profound respect for her previous relationship, Julius Caesar. And so it's a very interesting painting, because Octavian's clearly in a rough spot, because you have to kind of balance the fact that his adopted father, Julius Caesar, had this relationship with Cleopatra, but also the fact that she just fought a civil war against you and with Mark Antony. And so Octavian is not friendly to Cleopatra. However, he has to maintain a certain amount of decorum given Julius Caesar's relationship with her, even though he's dead. But I find this picture very interesting because it kind of tells a little bit of the past and the present for Octavian, in that you see the greatness and the kind of the overlooking of Julius Caesar. You can see that all of the Julius Caesar stuff is up here, looking down upon them, as Octavian and Cleopatra discuss things. She's sitting on a couch and he's sitting in a chair there. But it kind of shows you that Julius Caesar is kind of in the background of all of this. It's a very cool painting. But anyway, it can't be ignored. That these factions are all vying in the ways that they are when you read the Aeneid. It's very important that you have to remember these things. And when Octavian returns to Rome, he decides to set up a empire, like the capital E empire, the one with an emperor in charge. And so if you're keeping track of Roman history, this is really the first time since the kings that we've had monarchy in Rome. Rome went from 509 BC all the way until the Battle of Actium without a single ruler, with the exception of dictators here and there that do various things. This is a transformation of government. Octavian takes complete control for himself. He keeps the Senate in charge as an advisory board, but all elections are rigged, and he picks his own people. And so there's only the illusion of a Senate and an illusion of election. And Octavian is in complete control, and you can see the propaganda machine begin churning. Here, just to give you a couple ideas for the propaganda machine, is a statue called the Prima Porta of Augustus. This one right here. It shows an idealized version of Octavian, and you can see he's not he's not the kind of learned, bookish, kind of sickly little guy that he was, but in the statue he looks very much like almost like a demigod, like a Greek hero. He's very well proportioned. His face is very kind of stoically optimistic. His hair is always in the right exact place. His clothes are perfectly draped, etc. And you just get great proportionality, which is not realistic for Augustus, based on his descriptions on the sources. And so you get this propaganda machine. He is the emperor, and he ought to be idealized. And so you see these figures, and there was a standard. So every face of him kind of follows the exact same standard. We know this because of the hair flips. They're almost exactly the same across sculptures. But it's very cool that he starts putting these things up around the empire, these images of himself. Notice the foot walking forward, kind of stepping forward into the future. He's pointing into the future, a new beginning for Rome. And he's kind of staring both like into the distance and also a little bit up, keeping his optimistic chin high. And down here, you're probably always wondering what's with the Cupid as you look at this thing. And it does a couple of things. It gives you this kind of nod to Venus. Venus is, through the Aeneid, actually, the story of Aeneas, is connected with the family of Julius Caesar, the Julii. And so you're going to see that kind of like nod to the goddess Venus a lot in the Aeneid, because she is the mother of Aeneas, the main character of the Aeneid, and also the ancestor of the Julii, and Julius Caesar is included, and thus Augustus being the adopted son of Julius Caesar and the actual great nephew. So they would claim, hey, there's divine blood of Venus running through our veins. Anyway, so the propaganda begins, and something called Pax Romana happens. This is Augustus saying, finally, guys, after so many years of war, 2 civil wars, Marius and Sulla before that, a lot of class warfare, etc., he declares Pax Romana. Finally, Rome can have some peace, Roman peace. This is a little bit dark because it's propaganda. He's saying, look, there's peace, but like it's really because we've killed everybody already. Like we've spent a whole almost century, fighting it out, and finally it's stable. And that's kind of what the Pax Romana is referencing, is the stability after all of that. But it's kind of a darkness if you kind of consider how you get to the peace by duking it out for almost a century. And so it's really a little bit weird to call it a peace, but it is peace nonetheless. There is no active fighting. And so he has built the Arapakis, the altar of peace, which is shown below. It's in a very nice prime location in Rome, right along the Tiber. There, you can go visit it with those nice glass windows. So even if you can't go inside, you can still look at it. But he builds this thing. It's just as much propaganda as anything else, saying like, look, we're going to build an altar to the idea of peace. And it's a very beautiful building. So you get this idea that there's finally peace, and this is something that is very interesting among the poets we're going to talk about. The poets were probably very largely not in favor of monarchy. They had lived in the time of the Republic, and so they were very skeptical of Octavian, and as he's called now, Augustus. They're very skeptical of him because they know something about propaganda. They're poets. They know how to bend words, and they know something about republics. They've lived through the end of one, and so I think that they have to deal with reconciling the fact that they like the stability because they have never known a stable Rome, a peaceful Rome, but they also don't like how it got there. And so you have to, like, as a poet, kind of deal with the fact that you like the stability, but you also don't like who brought it and how they brought it. And so I think there's a bit of a conflict there. It's not supposed to be, there's not supposed to be a nice answer there. You can kind of be on each side for various reasons. And so these poets actually are hired by the Roman regime now. What happens is you get a lot of centralization of the Roman government, which means you no longer are just in little factions and things so much, is that you connect yourself with the emperor however you can. And so Augustus hires a guy to handle art and poetry and literature, and his name is Maecenas. He is the master of culture in Rome at this point now. And Maecenas collects all of the best poets into the same place, including Horace and Virgil and Ovid. And these guys, they all hang out together, and they write together, and they travel together, and they help each other with their work, and they discuss, and they write together. It's great. And so these guys are all given villas, and they're given opportunities to write. But in return, the emperor expects a bit of praise from the poetry that they write. And so you see Horace giving odes to Augustus here and there. You see Ovid. Ovid kind of rebels, but Virgil is then hired to write the national epic, the Aeneid, and the idea was to write something that would rival Homer. We have to rival the Odyssey and the Iliad, but it needs to be in Latin. It needs to be Roman because we're trying to show that the Romans have just as much legitimacy as the ancient Greeks. Everybody idealizes them, but Romans have just as much right to have some kind of great piece within the canon of epic poetry. And so he hires Virgil, probably the most talented of, if maybe Horace, of the three, and to write this epic poetry, and it has to be about Aeneas. But the thing is, it's propaganda. It is very much supposed to be for the emperor. And praising him and his new regime, and Augustus's morality campaign, saying like, "Hey, we should be good Romans, and we're going to clamp down on these various vices." And he's going to try to write that into the character Aeneas. But the cool thing about Augustus a little bit is that he does allow them some freedom. He realizes that poetry is best when the poets have a say in it. He does not mandate that everything be written a certain way. He just really wants his little nods here and there. And so you have to imagine Virgil having this job of writing something that's deep. It can't just be pure propaganda because it would read as disingenuous. So he has to make it a real good epic, but also kind of do what Augustus wants. And so he ends up balancing everything out. It's a very nice piece of literature that we're going to start reading here. But that's all the context. So he has to kind of write this Aeneid about Aeneas coming from Troy to Italy and kind of defining who the Roman people are, especially with this kind of new regime. He wants the what is Roman idea to be something that is told through epic. And so it'll be a very interesting read in that regard. But it's important to remember all of these things when considering the Aeneid. And with that, we're going to end this with the next slide, which is a discussion of the first 3 words of the Aeneid. So the first line of the Aeneid, very famous line, Arma virumque cano. It's actually half of the first line. Troiae qui primus aboris. And so you get Arma virumque cano. I sing of arms and a man. It's very general. It's very vague on purpose because we are talking about multiple things. Virgil knows exactly what he's doing. He knows that the first lines and the first phrases of good works are remembered and are supposed to be deep. And so what you get is a very broad, I sing of arms and a man. Well, arms, weapons being a very general term about warfare, and a man, there are many men in the world, so we have to kind of figure out what he's talking about. There are many interpretations here. I want to just quickly go through a couple of them. There is more detail to be had. I hope we can discuss this later. But when Virgil says, I sing of arms and a man, the first thing that should come to your mind is just simply, like, this is the most simple one, the plot of the Aeneid. The Aeneid is going to be about a man, Aeneas. Okay, so that's Virum. You're going to say, oh, okay, that's Aeneas. So number 1, we'll do Aeneas and his conflicts. That's going to be just like number 1 is the plot of the Aeneid is about Aeneas and his conflicts. I sing of arms and a man. Aeneas is going to come to Italy after kind of bouncing around the Mediterranean a bit, and there's going to be a giant war, just like the Iliad. So he's going to discuss the man, Aeneas, and the conflicts that he has, both warfare and personal. And so that's kind of interpretation number 1. And by the way, I think all of these things could apply a little bit. There's not like one answer to what he means by arma virumque cano. Number 2, we'll do in red for a second. We have Augustus being the Virum, right? And civil wars. So the Arma are all of the wars that had just happened. And this is the whole point of this whole presentation was for you to see the lead up to Augustus and how, like, the context in what Virgil's writing, because this is very present in Virgil's mind. Virgil lived through all of this, or most of it at least. Sorry, he probably wasn't a contemporary of Julius Caesar too much. Anyway, Augustus and the civil wars are very much an arma virumque idea, in that we know this is going to be about a single man, Augustus, and especially when in a monarchy, a single man, and the civil wars that got him there. And so you can say number 2 is definitely Augustus and the Civil War. Number 3, we can look at this as a nod to the 2 Homeric epics. He's going to take parts of the Iliad, which is largely about warfare, so arma, and the Odyssey, which is largely about a man and his journey. And so you can say, arma virumque cano, I sing of arms and a man. I sing about the Iliad and the Odyssey, the one with the war and the one with the guy. Are there men in the Iliad? Yes. Are there conflicts in the Odyssey? Yes. But mostly the Iliad is about the whole war itself and about fate, and the Odyssey is about a man and his journey. And so you can kind of say, like, he's hinting that he's doing something Homeric. And there are many examples of, within the Aeneid, him kind of giving a nod to Homer. And the 4th, I would argue, is simply about, we can kind of generalize Aeneas and the conflict into, like, what does it mean to be a person with the various conflicts? And so you can say it's a generalized, like, what does it mean to live a certain human experience and to have these conflicts and to get through them or not get through them, or what do we remember about them? There's a lot to be said about the human experience in the Aeneid, and so I think that Virgil's probably writing these 3 words to kind of invoke a lot of these ideas. And I hope that this presentation has served its purpose, and to now, as we read the Aeneid, you can understand a bit of why he's writing what he's writing. Thank you.